Welcome back to Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. It's Nancy. And if you're new to the podcast, Dead Sleep is a true crime podcast made for nighttime listening. A niche podcast made for people like me, weirdos who like to fall asleep listening to true crime and just want a good story, not too violent, not too graphic. Oh, and perhaps most important, not filled with obnoxious, blaring ads right in the middle of the show that blast you awake. That's not going to happen here because Dead Sleep is listener supported. So thanks to you, we keep this show going. And for tonight's episode, I thought it'd be nice to bring it back to an origin story, a fairy tale. One of my favorites, and maybe one of yours too when you were growing up. The story of Little Red Riding Hood. Only, of course, in this story, it's a true story. A fairy tale with a dark twist. In the traditional story of Little Red Riding Hood, Little Red, the little girl, goes to visit her grandmama. And unbeknownst to the little girl, the grandmama has been replaced by a wolf who dresses in grandma's clothing. And after eating grandma, the wolf tucks itself into grandma's bed, a high-necked nightgown covering its dark, bristly fur, a bedquilt raised high to hide its sharp teeth and eager jaw, and, of course, a sleeping cap pulled over its large, alert ears. And the wolf gets into bed and waits. And waits, and waits for Little Red Riding Hood to come into the home, to be by her grandma's bedside. Little Red Riding Hood, ever so observant, looks at grandma and notices a few features that are different than her real grandma. She notices what big eyes her grandmother has. And of course, what big teeth the grandmother has. But Little Red Riding Hood, being as trusting as she is, doesn't realize it's a wolf until it's too late. And what the wolf is going to do to Little Red? Well, eat her, of course, in the fairy tale version. But I want you to imagine if the Little Red Riding Hood scenario were a little different. And in the Dead Sleep version of this story, the true story, what if it were a wolf pretending to be a little girl? What if it was the grandmother who was disturbed and unsure about whether or not her little granddaughter, 7, 8 years old, was secretly a cute little blonde girl on the outside, but on the inside is a thief, a liar, and derives sadistic pleasure from hurting other people. A budding sociopath who's just figuring out that she doesn't think like other kids. She doesn't have the same feelings other kids have. She only really sees things and feels things in black and white. And that's happiness and anger. A rare, compulsive, and temporary feeling of happiness when she gets what she wants, and a far more common, far more dangerous, toxic rage when she doesn't get what she wants. And everything in between is nothing. It's like only being able to taste vanilla ice cream or battery acid. So those are the two poles in which she experiences life. And those other things that children feel, healthy things, that's fear, embarrassment, guilt, even shame. Those are the pathways that children learn empathy, kindness, consideration, caution, and self-preservation. That our real-life Little Red, she doesn't feel. So tonight, you're going to hear the real-life story, which I have transformed into a bedtime story, inspired by the memoir of Patric Gagne. Patric is a woman, a grown woman, who became famous, very famous, for her essay that was first published in the New York Times, that became a book that just came out that I just read, called Sociopath. People have a lot of opinions about this book, and I'm still figuring out how I feel about her story. But I was intrigued to try and transform it into a bedtime story about a little girl who suspects there's something wrong with her, and she goes on a journey to find out what exactly that is. What is a sociopath? And if you are one, is there any way that you can turn out to be something other than a cold-hearted criminal or serial killer? Can a bad seed grow up and bloom to be something beautiful? Or does it just contaminate the soil around it, ensuring that nothing grows? We'll find out in tonight's episode. And I invite you to ask yourself, how am I feeling tonight? Are you plagued by anxiety or shame or guilt or sadness or compassion or worry about others? It turns out that's good. And we'll embrace those feelings as we settle in for the night. Get cozy under those covers, or in my case, one simple linen crisp sheet, because it's very hot right now in the summertime. And we'll get ready to fall dead asleep with Dead Sleep True Crime for bedtime. And a bedtime story I'm calling Little Miss Sociopath. It was supposed to be a vacation, this trip. Her mother hadn't said much. She just said to pack a suitcase. Just one suitcase. Just a quick trip, a little vacation, for a girl I'll refer to as Patty, and her sister, and her mother, and they'd all go on a little trip to visit their grandmother in Florida. Florida has the largest remaining subtropical wilderness left in North America. It's the home of the Everglades. The Everglades is situated between temperate North America and the tropical Caribbean. And what you're hearing right now, that's the sound of rain in a mangrove forest found along the coastal channels and rivers within South Florida. And hidden somewhere in the Everglades is the American crocodile, a cold-blooded apex predator that lurks in the brackish water, hiding and biding its time until it can safely reveal itself and feed and destroy. And that's what Patty felt like. Cold-blooded, dead-eyed, a crocodile. No excitement or pleasure, no joy. Just a vague sense of yay when she got her way. And when she didn't, it was a blistering rage. Crocodile, wolf, whatever animal she was, who knew? What she did know was that she didn't feel human. At least not in the way most children her age did. And she sensed, for as long as she could remember, something being off about her. She didn't know what it was, but she had a vibe. and she knew it was cold and unpleasant, and that children avoided her, maybe were afraid of her. Patty couldn't understand it. She didn't know what her problem was until she went to visit her grandmother on that family outing. And that's where she found her people, or rather, her fellow predators. Hiding, lurking, waiting, just like her. It was 1987 somewhere in Florida when 11-year-old Patty strode into a Supermax high-security men's prison. The so-called vacation to Florida to visit Grandma had already stretched into months and now years. It turned out Patty's mother had left Patty's father and moved from California to Florida to live full-time with Patty's grandmother and extended family. Not that this surprise move bothered Patty. She didn't have any friends back in California anyway. She didn't understand it, why the girls in school found her so weird. She fancied herself as a blonde Wednesday Addams, leisurely repelling everyone in her path. But from the outside, her behavior was more like the demon child, Damien, from The Omen. Maybe one of the reasons why nobody liked her was connected to a violent incident involving Patty and a pencil. Just before Patty and her sister and her mom moved to Florida, Patty had a disagreement with a girl in school. And instead of using her words, as kids are taught to do, Patty let the number 2 pencil in her hand do the talking, lodging the tip of the pencil into the little girl's neck. As the girl cried in pain and those around Patty screamed in horror, Patty felt a surge of euphoria. She would later say she didn't want to kill the girl, but she didn't feel any regrets or remorse about stabbing her. In fact, it felt like a release. All the tension in her body suddenly feeling relaxed. When her mother found out about it, she seemed at a loss. And between her failed marriage and her troubled daughter, it might come as no surprise that her mother moved to Florida for more support. But Grandma wasn't the doting type, at least not when it came to Patty. Patty and her sister were largely unsupervised, and Patty sensed even her own mother was now avoiding her. Which was why this prison visit to this Supermax men's prison in Florida in 1987 felt so special. Because it was Patty, her sister, and her mother together at the prison visiting Patty's uncle. Patty's uncle was a prison guard, there to keep watch over hundreds of violent, potentially mentally disturbed criminals, never realizing, at least not then anyway, that one of the most violent and potentially mentally disturbed of them all was the tween girl standing right beside him. Her uncle and a fellow prison guard gave Patty a tour, which included a special room filled with monitors, each screen streaming a live feed of all corners of the prison. Now, most kids would be scared, but not Patty. Patty was fearless. She literally had no sense of fear. Instead, she was fascinated by all the men, especially when her uncle's coworker, a fellow guard, taught her how to zoom in to get a good look at each inmate. What had they done, she wondered, to get locked up like this? The guard explained these men did bad things, including murder and arson. But he explained it wasn't just what they did. It's that they weren't sorry about it. and that's why they were still incarcerated. Because 80% of these men, the guard said, they're sociopaths. Patty hadn't heard that word before. What was a sociopath? She asked. The guard explained that a sociopath was a word for a person that doesn't feel bad about what they do. Someone who never felt guilty, no shame, never scared, and because they're not afraid of getting caught, they're destined to repeat the same stupid mistakes over and over again. But this wasn't anything Patty had to worry about, the guard said. She wasn't like them. Patty didn't say anything out loud to that guard, but inside, in that hollow little husk where her heart was supposed to be, she knew the truth. She was one of them. In many ways, she felt no fear, no guilt. She reveled in deception and found illicit jubilation in doing bad things. At least now she had a word for it. Sociopath. Is that really what she was, Patty wondered? A sociopath? And if she was like this now at 11 years old, what would happen in a few years? What was she capable of? And what could she do about it? There was an upside to being Patty. Unlike most awkward kids, she didn't give a damn about what other people thought of her. She was arrogant and defiant. She wasn't afraid of getting caught and rarely considered consequences. Patty broke into empty houses. She stole things from strangers to teach them a lesson. To get back at her mother for doing something that she didn't like, Patty flushed a pair of her mother's favorite earrings down the toilet. Patty spent hours by herself, playing with her only true friend, a pet ferret she named Baby. But her fearlessness had a terrifying side, especially for a girl who was essentially latchkey. One time, when she and her little sister were playing outside by themselves, a strange man came up and told the girls he had a pair of kittens. Would they like a kitten? They could have them for free. Just follow him. Her little sister was scared. Here was this stranger offering them kittens. Her little sister sensed in her gut, this didn't feel right. But Patty, she didn't have that same sixth sense. She only knew of her own selfish, compulsive desires. So she said, "Sure, I'll take a kitten." And then she followed the man down the street. And as she rounded the corner, alone with this man, she noticed a van parked in a driveway. The man gestured to the van, waving to Patty for her to get in. Patty looked towards the van, and inside the van was a woman with a cardboard box. Patty couldn't see inside the box, but that must be where the kittens were, she thought. "Come look," the woman in the van said. "The kittens are so cute." The man walked alongside Patty now, and as he did, he pointed to the house where the van was parked. "That's my van," he said, "and that's my house." And that's when Patty realized this man was lying. She knew that house was empty because she'd broken into it more times than she could remember. She'd hung out inside that empty house by herself just a few days earlier. There was no way this was his house. Patty didn't feel fear, but she was equipped with a survival instinct. She plastered on a big fake smile and disarmed the man by asking him a few questions. Was that woman in the van his wife? What was her name? And within a few seconds, she noticed the stranger's face change. She didn't know him, but she knew that face. the face of someone who's just realized the girl standing in front of him was extremely creepy. And that creepiness, it threw him off just a moment. Whatever he was going to do, kidnap her in the van, whatever it was, he hesitated. Just long enough to give Patty enough time to bolt. And she ran away from the man who angrily yelled after her and back down the street, back home, back to where she was the only menace, the only one people were afraid of, the only one people didn't want to be around or know what to do with, including her own mother. There's a movie, there's actually 3 of them, called The Bad Seed. The first Bad Seed came out in the 1950s, and then there were 2 subsequent remakes, one in 1985 and a later 2018 remake. If you haven't seen those movies, The Bad Seed tells the story of a young mother who slowly begins to discover that her 8-year-old daughter, her little blonde angel who seems conscientious and compliant to other adults, is, in actuality, an antisocial deviant, a pint-sized pathological liar, and a budding serial killer. And all of this becomes clear before she finishes the 3rd grade. In the movie, the mother wonders what made her daughter that way. And as the mother does some digging into her own past, she discovers a shocking family secret. This, by the way, is going to be a spoiler alert on a 70-year-old movie. She uncovers that she, herself, the mother, was adopted when she was just a baby. And that she, the mom, is actually the direct descendant, the only surviving child of a notorious female serial killer, which leads her to the horrifying realization that her daughter is the way she is because of her. That being a serial killer is in the mom's DNA, which she passed on to her own little girl. That, of course, was fiction. In real life, in Patty's story, what did her mother think was wrong with her little girl? Or maybe there wasn't anything wrong with her. Maybe Patty was right, and the rest of the world was wrong. Because right around the time that Patty was coming of age, a popular book about adolescent girls was published. In the 1990s, it was called Reviving Ophelia. And this book posited an understanding about tweens and teens that, at the time, was revolutionary. That at a crucial age between, say, 12 to 17, pubescent girls faced extraordinary pressure to submit to social and cultural expectations. Expectations to be more feminine, which meant more submissive, less opinionated. And that girls were up against a violent and sexist culture that eroded self-esteem and led to gender-based, self-destructive pathologies like disordered eating or self-harm. In her teen years, Patty didn't have issues of self-esteem. She was brazen and confident and didn't submit to anyone. Maybe that was a better way to be. Maybe with all of the harassment and BS teen girls had to face, maybe we all could have benefited from a splash of Sociopath. But Patty, she was escalating. because she was plagued with a virulent form of apathy. She couldn't feel anything, didn't care about anything. And by high school, she was venturing out late at night, breaking into empty houses, stalking people for cheap thrills. Those transgressions were the only things that gave her an emotional charge. She had one friend, a guy named David. He was the only one that she felt comfortable with. And outside of this guy, David, there wasn't really anyone else. Even her little sister recognized her pathetic emptiness, and it seems that she took pity on her and tried to transform her sister's antisocial disorder into something upbeat. Patty's little sister drew a picture of a cartoon superhero, an anti-hero, that she named Captain Apathy. Captain Apathy, that was Patty. Her catchphrase was, "Never fear, Captain Apathy doesn't care." By the time she was old enough to apply to college, Patty knew she had to leave her small conservative Florida town, where everyone knew her, and she needed to move to bigger territory, where she could live life on her own terms without hiding from her own mother or rubbing off as a bad influence on her sweet little sister. She needed a big city, the kind filled with strange people, where you could walk the streets as an aspiring serial killer and know you were in good company, a place where she could hide in plain sight. Where else would she go but California, Los Angeles, the city of angels and home of the serial killers, the Manson family, the Night Stalker, the Hillside Strangler, the Grim Sleeper, and now there was Captain Apathy. Conveniently, Patty's father worked in the music industry and lived in Los Angeles. And like a moth to a flame, Patty enrolled as an undergrad at UCLA with a keen interest in psychology. Maybe if she studied the human mind, she could find out what exactly was wrong with her. It wouldn't take long before she had answers. In a Psych 101 class, when a professor named Dr. Slack stood up and right in front of everyone scrawled a word on the chalkboard, and that word was sociopathy. Sociopathy. Patty listened to the lecture spellbound. This professor was speaking to the whole class, but it felt like she was directly speaking to Patty, like the college lecture version of Killing Me Softly, singing Patty's life with her words. Sociopathy, the professor explained, is a disorder characterized by a disinclination to empathize with others. They don't process emotion like everyone else. They don't feel like everyone else. And it is the lack of feeling that causes them to behave aggressively and destructively. The sociopath's subconscious desire to feel is what forces them to act out. The desire to feel forces someone to behave aggressively and destructively. Patty remembered, roughly a decade earlier, when she first heard that word from the prison guard in Florida, sociopath. But this was the first time Patty heard the definition of that word with any meaningful insight. But plenty of first-year psychology students think they have every disorder listed in the DSM, which Patty soon learned was short for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. There's even a term for it, medical student syndrome. But the difference between Patty and other students who mistakenly believed they had every syndrome under the sun was that Patty could feel herself escalating, that her bad deeds gave her black and white world a pop of what she called emotional color. She found herself fantasizing about stabbing people, To relieve stress, she borrowed people's cars and cruised around LA on late-night solo joyrides. She had no real personality of her own, so she co-opted the mannerisms of others, including her own little sister, and then derived pleasure from manipulating and exploiting those people. She wasn't crazy, she thought. This was her coping mechanism, her method of survival. If she pissed people off with her selfish behavior, who cares? She didn't. She wasn't capable of caring. Patty was a cold, creepy child, an emotionally blank bummer of a daughter and sister, and a nightmare college roommate. All of this she knew. But what she needed to understand was this. Was she really a sociopath? And if she were, at least she'd know for sure. And maybe there'd be help for her out there, because somewhere in the darkest, bleakest, emptiest regions of her mind, there was the tiniest flicker of interest, a teeny blip of recognition that she wanted to change. Patty threw herself into diagnosing her own condition, and she learned that the word sociopath wasn't the clinical diagnostic term anymore. More accurate was antisocial personality disorder, and this definition included sociopaths and psychopaths. And it turned out there was a checklist of 16 signs you have a form of antisocial personality disorder, including sociopathic or psychopathic tendencies. Patty scanned the list of 16 signs, and she checked off nearly every single thing on that list. This included being a person with superficial charm and good intelligence. Check, obviously. Lack of remorse or shame about things that she'd done. Pathologic egocentricity and incapacity for love. Fantastic and uninviting behavior with drink and sometimes without. Failure to follow any life plan. Check, check, and check. In a way, checking all of those things off the list was a strange relief. At least she knew what she was, and she wasn't alone. Then again, this checklist was for sociopaths and psychopaths. What was the difference? Or were they essentially the same thing? That a sociopath would eventually become a psychopath? She didn't know where she was going to end up, but she knew where she didn't want to be. A criminal, a killer, in prison. She was already taking dangerous risks, stuff that would land most people in jail. But not Patty. Nobody noticed, because she was a wolf, hiding in sorority girls' clothing. As she looked into her own condition, through her research at UCLA, she discovered sociopaths and psychopaths were different in many ways, but they often shared the same fate. That eventually, their feelings of apathy, of nothingness, the absence of feeling, become so maddening, the weight of nothingness so hard to bear, they eventually lose control, and they snap. Patty didn't want to snap. She wanted to feel. Patty knew she didn't get help, she'd either end up dead or in prison. She needed to change, but how? This was the 90s and early 2000s when serial killers were all over movies and TV. And on movies and in TV, they were cunning and clever, like Silence of the Lambs and Seven. And in the world of these psychopaths, killing people was a form of expression, murder as motif. In real life, Patty noticed there wasn't a standard protocol to treat sociopaths or psychopaths, at least not what she saw. So she leaned into her own strengths as a sociopath, that fearlessness, that ego, and she decided defiantly, that she'd be the first to find a treatment, maybe a cure, for people like her. People she defined as being on the sociopath spectrum. If autism can be on a spectrum, Patty theorized that sociopathy could be too. Whether sociopathy counts as neurodivergent is unclear, but it felt true to Patty. And at least this notion of being on a spectrum gave her something she hadn't felt before. She felt hopeful. If no one else can figure out what sociopathy is, she'd figure it out for herself. And if that meant she'd be a lonely little sociopath, well, so be it. At first, her prognosis seemed grim. People like her, they often weren't capable of change because they weren't capable of human connection. They didn't know what love was. But, wait, Patty realized she did know what love was. She was in college now, but her mind flashed back to high school, back when she felt what love was, or what at least it could be, thanks to a boy back in high school named David. She had feelings for David, which she was happy to discover must mean that she wasn't a psychopath, which meant that she could learn to be a better human. There was hope for her. So around the time she was in college, she reached out to David to test if she felt anything. David seemed okay with the fact that she was in the process of deciding if she was a psychopath or a sociopath. And he was the only one she felt relaxed around, that she was honest with, a person she didn't instantly seek to control or manipulate. And if that wasn't love, what is? Because she had the capacity to love, perhaps she had the capacity to change. And little by little, she made those changes. Instead of doing big, terrible acts like stealing cars and breaking into houses, she did little transgressions, such as standing behind someone in a grocery store line and adding a secret item into the checkout line. These things may seem silly or petty or ridiculous, but to Patty, it was a huge step forward. She enjoyed the release, but without causing anyone any real pain. And with those changes, she grew closer to David. And eventually she realized she wanted to be his partner. Maybe she didn't know what love was exactly, but she recognized the importance of symbiosis. It took time, but in the end, Patty would find herself a mother and a wife, two things she didn't think were possible. Along with that, she became a mental health professional herself. Was it all happily ever after? No, but it was something. And for Patty, feeling something was better than feeling nothing. In fact, it was everything. Thank you so much for listening to Dead Sleep. This is just one interpretation of someone else's true story. And I'm so curious to hear your thoughts on the actual book, Sociopath, which I'll link to in the show notes among other sources I reference in this piece. I'll be back with a bonus episode in a few days and a whole new true crime bedtime story next week. Until then, nighty-night.